Friends, thank you for being here today. What if I told you that the geopolitical map of the Western Hemisphere is being redrawn right now? Not with armies or invasions, but with infrastructure contracts, currency swaps, and a fundamental shift in political identity. And ask yourself this: how would the United States react if it woke up one morning to find that the very foundation of its power, its control over energy, finance, and alliances in its own backyard, had effectively crumbled while the world was looking elsewhere? The answer to that question explains the palpable fury currently radiating from Washington, D.C. We are living through a historical inflection point. For over 2 centuries, the United States has operated under the Monroe Doctrine, the implicit and often explicit assumption that Latin America is the exclusive sphere of influence for Washington. It was a region where American corporations extracted resources, American banks dictated fiscal policy, and American diplomats selected winners and losers. But as we approach a new year, the ground has shifted beneath our feet. We are witnessing a synchronized, two-pronged dismantling of this hegemony. On one front, China has released a formalized strategic roadmap that redefines Latin America, not as a subordinate neighbor to the north, but as a pivotal player in the global south. On the other front, Mexico, historically the most dependent of U.S. partners, has issued a stunning ultimatum, revoking contracts and reclaiming energy sovereignty in a move that has left U.S. policymakers scrambling. Today, we are going to explore why Washington is furious, detailing the collapse of the old order and the rise of a new multipolar reality. To understand the root of this fury, we must first examine the strategic pivot that is causing such alarm in the capital: China OAS new roadmap for the Western Hemisphere. Washington OAS primary source of anxiety does not stem merely from a trade deficit or a lost contract here and there. It stems from a systemic challenge presented by Beijing's newly updated policy toward Latin America and the Caribbean. This is not just a routine diplomatic update, it is a comprehensive strategic pivot that signals China AS intent to integrate the region into a post-American global order. For decades, the relationship between the US and Latin America was vertical, a hierarchy of power flowing from north to south. China's third official policy paper on the region completely upends this geometry. The most striking aspect of this document is its framing. It explicitly reframes Latin America and the Caribbean not as a backyard, but as a critical, independent segment of the global south. This terminological shift is profound. It is a political identity that unifies the developing world against the traditional hegemon. By positioning Latin America as a peer in the global south, Beijing is validating the region's autonomy and stroking its strategic ego in a way Washington rarely has. The vision China proposes is one of a multipolar world. In this worldview, power is dispersed among multiple centers: Beijing, Moscow, Brasilia, New Delhi, rather than concentrated in Washington. The document speaks of building a community with a shared future, a rhetorical device that stands in stark contrast to the US versus them narrative, often emanating from Western capitals. This is a direct ideological challenge to the Monroe Doctrine. It signals that the era where the United States could unilaterally dictate the rules of the road in the Western Hemisphere is fading into history. Furthermore, Beijing is moving beyond mere economic transactionalism to deepen political and diplomatic ties in unprecedented ways. The cornerstone of this new relationship is the One China principle. Beijing has made it clear: recognition of Taiwan is a non-starter. For those nations that align with the One China policy, Beijing promises mutual support on issues of sovereignty and territorial integrity. This is a powerful lure for Latin American nations that have often felt their sovereignty violated by U.S. interventions. Perhaps most concerning for U.S. strategists is the breadth of China's institutional engagement. Western diplomacy has traditionally focused on the executive branch, presidents and foreign ministers. China is rewriting this playbook by seeking deep, structural ties with legislatures, political parties, and local government institutions. They are building influence from the ground up, ensuring that their presence survives any single election cycle. Crucially, this cooperation is non-ideological, unlike the United States, which has a long history of conditioning aid and cooperation on ideological conformity. Favoring free market neoliberals and punishing leftists, China is willing to engage with anyone. Left, right, populist, technocratic. It does not matter to Beijing. They prioritize long-term stability and mutual benefit over ideological purity. This pragmatic approach allows them to make inroads where the U.S. has burned bridges. Security, too, is part of this new equation. Under the banner of the Global Security Initiative, China is positioning itself as a legitimate security partner in the Americas. This goes beyond selling a few rifles. We are talking about frequent military exchanges, personnel training, and defense coordination. They are focusing on non-traditional security areas that matter to local populations, such as counterterrorism, humanitarian assistance, and disaster relief. By offering this aid without the heavy-handed political strings attached to Western military assistance, China is slowly displacing the U.S. as the partner of choice for security cooperation. Now, if the political pivot is the mind of this new strategy, the financial decoupling is undoubtedly its heart, aiming to dismantle the dominance of the dollar. The strategic roadmap moves beyond the concrete and steel of the Belt and Road Initiative to attack the very lifeblood of U.S. power, the financial system. For nearly a century, the U.S. dollar has been the undisputed king of global commerce. This dominance allowed the U.S. to print money to fund its deficits and, more weaponized, to sanction any nation that crossed it. China is now actively pushing for economic sovereignty in Latin America, which is a polite diplomatic euphemism for de-dollarization. Beijing is encouraging nations to reduce their dependence on the dollar in regional trade to protect their economies from the weaponization of U.S. currency. We are seeing a proliferation of local currency trading. China is promoting currency swap agreements that allow trade to be settled in yuan or local currencies like the riel or the peso. The goal is to create a parallel financial ecosystem. By expanding the presence of Chinese banks and financial institutions in the region, Beijing is building an alternative architecture to the IMF and the World Bank. In this new system, nations in financial distress have an option other than the austerity measures typically demanded by Western institutions. They can turn to Beijing. This financial decoupling weakens the most potent lever of coercion Washington possesses, the ability to cut a nation off from the global financial system. While China provides the roadmap, Mexico is providing the action, leading a reclamation of sovereignty that can only be described as an energy revolt. The theoretical threat of a multipolar world has materialized into a concrete, devastating reality in Mexico, where the government is dismantling decades of U.S. control over its energy sector. This is the energy revolt, and it is shaking the U.S. energy establishment to its core. Under the leadership of President Claudia Sheinbaum, continuing the nationalist policies of her predecessor, Mexico has issued what can only be described as an ultimatum. The government announced the unilateral revocation of 47 exploration contracts previously held by major U.S. corporations, including giants like ExxonMobil and Chevron, in the Gulf of Mexico. Simultaneously, Sheinbaum declared that Pemex, Petróleos Mexicanos, would resume exclusive control over the nation's exclusive economic zone, EEZ. This is not a minor regulatory adjustment. It is the boldest geopolitical move by Mexico since the original oil expropriation of 1938. How could Mexico, a nation so economically integrated with the U.S., dare to take such a step? The answer lies in the new alliances that have broken its dependency. This defiance is enabled by specific, high-value partnerships that replace U.S. capabilities. China has stepped in with an $18 billion deal to transfer deep-water drilling technology to Pemex, technology the U.S. had guarded jealously. Russia has provided specialized engineers and refining equipment worth $6.7 billion crucially without political conditions. Furthermore, a new trilateral energy alliance between Mexico, Brazil, and Venezuela creates a bloc capable of processing 4.2 million barrels of oil daily, completely outside the U.S. price control mechanisms. Mexico is no longer alone. It has powerful friends. However, to truly grasp why Mexico is taking such bold steps today, we cannot ignore the past. We must confront the historical context of what many call a century of aggressions. To understand the ferocity of Mexico's current stance and the depth of its resolve, we must look at the history that led us here. This is not a sudden, irrational outburst. It is a calculated response to what many in Mexico view as a century of aggressions and resource extraction by their northern neighbor. The grievances are documented and deep. Let us recall the financial coercion of 1995, often called the reverse expropriation. Following the devastating peso crisis, the U.S. offered a bailout, but it came with a poison pill. Secretary of the Treasury Robert Rubin conditioned the $50 billion rescue package on Mexico, opening its energy sector to private, specifically American, participation. It was a moment of national humiliation where sovereignty was traded for solvency. Then there was the technological sabotage of 2008, when Pemex attempted to develop its own deep-water drilling technology with the help of Brazil's Petrobras. The U.S. Department of Commerce intervened. Citing dubious national security concerns, they blocked the sale of critical drilling components manufactured by U.S. firms like Halliburton. This delay set Mexico's development back by years, costing billions in unrealized production. A clear message that Mexico was not allowed to become technologically independent. Between 2010 and 2016, we witnessed price manipulation. WikiLeaks cables and internal documents revealed a coordinated effort by U.S. diplomats and oil executives to pressure Pemex into selling its Maya crude at an 18% discount relative to global benchmarks. The threat was blunt: sell cheap, or U.S. refineries would stop buying. This cartel-like behavior resulted in an estimated loss of $34 billion in revenue for the Mexican state, wealth transferred directly from the Mexican people to the balance sheets of U.S. corporations. The legal warfare continued with the legal extraction of 2019. Using the investor-state dispute settlement mechanisms in the USMCA, Corporations sued Mexico for canceling permits in environmentally protected areas. The arbitration panels, often staffed by corporate-friendly lawyers, awarded $4.8 billion in compensation for contracts that had not even been executed. Companies were paid for profits they imagined they would make. In 2021, we saw the reserve suppression. For years, the U.S. Energy Information Administration systematically underreported Mexican oil reserves in official estimates. They claimed Mexico had only 6.7 billion barrels when independent geologists knew the number was closer to 18 billion. This gaslighting served two purposes. It depressed the market value of Pemex to facilitate cheap privatization, and it justified U.S. arguments that they needed to drill in disputed waters because Mexico was running out of oil. Finally, the geological claims of 2023 regarding the Zama field. The U.S. Department of the Interior attempted to claim royalties on this massive find, arguing that because the oil field stretched geologically across the maritime border, the U.S. was entitled to a 41% share. The reality? 73% of the field was in Mexican waters. It was an attempt to tax Mexican resources in Mexican territory, the ultimate act of imperial overreach. This leads us to the core reason why Washington is so furious. The total collapse of its strategic leverage. Why is Washington furious? Because it is impotent. For decades, the U.S. managed Latin America using a toolkit of coercion: finance, technology, market access, and legal warfare. Today, in a stunning reversal, every single one of those tools has failed simultaneously. The failure of financial control. When the U.S. tried to use finance as a carrot, offering a $12 billion export-import bank package to modernize Pemex, the strings attached were visible to everyone. The deal required 70% of contracts to go to U.S. firms. President Sheinbaum rejected it. Why? Because she had a better offer. The BRICS Development Bank offered unconditional financing at lower interest rates. And China brought direct investment. The U.S. credit card was declined because Mexico found a better bank. The failure of technological monopoly. The U.S. long held a stranglehold on deep water drilling through companies like Halliburton and Schlumberger. That monopoly is dead. When the U.S. refused to share, China's CNOC transferred superior technology capable of operating at 3,500 meters depth. Similarly, when U.S. refineries refused to upgrade Mexican facilities, Russia provided catalytic refining systems that increased gasoline yields by 17%. The technology blockade didn't stop Mexico. It just forced Mexico to upgrade its technology partners. The failure of market dominance. This is perhaps the most critical shift. The U.S. used to operate as a monopsony, a single buyer with all the power. Historically, the U.S. consumed 68% of Mexican oil exports. If the U.S. stopped buying, Mexico collapsed. That leverage has evaporated. Today, China imports 1.1 million barrels of Mexican crude daily. The failure of legal warfare. Finally, the threat of lawsuits has lost its sting. When U.S. corporations prepared their armies of lawyers to sue over the revoked contracts, China stepped in with a checkbook, offering to assume financial obligations in exchange for long-term supply. Simultaneously, the BRICS Bank established a legal defense fund. U.S. lawyers can win all the arbitrations they want. If Mexico has the backing to ignore them or pay them off with Chinese money, the political pressure evaporates. As we examine the specific mechanisms of energy power, we can see clearly how the pillars of the U.S. energy order are crumbling. The refining monopoly is gone. For 80 years, Latin American producers had to send their crude to the U.S. Gulf Coast to be refined. It was a colonial economic structure. But with new massive refineries in China, like the Jiang facility, Russian-built modular refineries in Venezuela, and Mexico's flagship Dos Bocas refinery coming online, the U.S. processing infrastructure is becoming redundant. Latin America is refining its own oil or sending it to Asia. Consequently, we are seeing the end of WTI pricing hegemony. The West Texas Intermediate WTI benchmark has determined the price of oil in the Western Hemisphere for 50 years. It allowed U.S. markets to set the price, but as trade shifts to Asia, the WTI is losing relevance. Mexico and other producers are increasingly pricing their exports based on the Shanghai International Energy Exchange, denominated in yuan. This bypasses U.S. price discovery entirely and eliminates the arbitrage profits that sustained U.S. trading firms for decades. This brings us to a critical and perhaps the most ironic dimension of this crisis, the geopolitical checkmate of the nearshoring paradox. U.S. policymakers spent the last 5 years aggressively pushing a narrative of nearshoring or friendshoring, the idea that American companies should move their supply chains out of China and into friendly neighboring countries like Mexico. The logic seems sound: shorten supply chains, reduce reliance on Beijing, and integrate the North American economy into a fortress that could withstand global turbulence. But friends, here's the twist that has turned this strategy into a nightmare for Washington. China saw this coming, and China moved first. Instead of isolating China, the nearshoring push has simply incentivized Chinese industry to relocate to Mexico. We are witnessing a massive surge of Chinese foreign direct investment, FDI, into the Mexican manufacturing sector. Chinese companies are building industrial parks in Monterrey and Saltillo at a frantic pace. They are not just setting up shell companies. They are building the factories that build the future. From electric vehicles to advanced electronics, China is essentially using Mexico as a backdoor to the U.S. market, effectively bypassing tariffs and trade restrictions. The USMCA, designed to strengthen North American autonomy, is inadvertently acting as a Trojan horse for Chinese capital and technology. This creates a paralyzing dilemma for the United States, a true checkmate scenario. Because the U.S. economy is so deeply intertwined with Mexico's manufacturing base, Washington cannot attack Chinese interests in Mexico without inflicting severe damage on itself. Remember, the supply chains are fused. A car assembled in Michigan often relies on parts made in a Chinese-owned factory in Mexico. If the U.S. slaps sanctions on these entities, it drives up inflation for American consumers and halts assembly lines in Detroit. The U.S. is effectively financing its own strategic displacement. By purchasing goods from Mexico to avoid China, it is funding the very Chinese industrial expansion it sought to prevent. Furthermore, this integration goes beyond just widgets and car parts. It is shifting the technological center of gravity. As China transfers advanced manufacturing technology to Mexico, technology for EV batteries, 5G networks, and automation, it is helping Mexico climb the value chain in a way the U.S. rarely did. For decades, the U.S. treated Mexico as a source of cheap labor. China is treating Mexico as an industrial partner. This distinction is not lost on Mexican leadership. It reinforces the political pivot we discussed earlier. When Mexico looks at who is offering the tools for modernization, they see Beijing offering high-tech partnerships, while Washington offers border walls and labor enforcement. So, the fury in Washington is not just about losing control of oil. It is about the realization that their grand strategy for economic security has backfired. They built a fortress called North America, locked the front gate against China, and then realized, too late, that China had already bought the keys to the back door. The interdependence that was supposed to secure U.S. power has now become the very mechanism that accelerates its decline, leaving policymakers with no good options and a neighbor that is economically stronger and geopolitically more independent than ever before. I am really curious to hear your perspective on this specific point. Do you think this strategic backfire was inevitable, or was it a failure of foresight? Drop a comment below and let's get a discussion going. In the final analysis, friends, what we are witnessing is a geopolitical shift that scholars call the realist outcome. And if you're finding value in this breakdown of global geopolitics, please make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It really helps support the work we do here. Washington's fury is not the anger of the righteous. It is the panic of a hegemon witnessing the structural collapse of its sphere of influence. Realist theory tells us that nations will always seek to maximize their survival by acquiring material power. For decades, Latin American states were subordinate to the U.S., not because they wanted to be, but because they had no choice. The unipolar moment left them with no alternatives. But the rise of China, the resurgence of Russia, and the emergence of India have provided those alternatives. By leveraging these new powers, states like Mexico have achieved the ultimate strategic goal of any sovereign nation, the ability to say no. They can say no to U.S. contracts, no to U.S. military bases, and no to U.S. diplomatic pressure without fearing economic collapse. The Monroe Doctrine is not just being challenged, it is being rendered obsolete by the facts on the ground. The furious reaction from Washington is the sound of an empire realizing that the world has changed, and it was not invited to the planning meeting. The future of the Americas is no longer being written solely in English. It is being written in Spanish, Portuguese, and Mandarin, in a narrative of sovereignty that changes everything. Thank you.